go back.
Spoilers in the video, obviously. Loads of them. Loads of them. I really don't give a fuck, so be warned. Final Fantasy VII Remake is genius. It's genius. You can argue whether it's good or bad genius, but that doesn't change the fact that Final Fantasy VII Remake is a masterpiece of subversion. Even if that subversion makes Final Fantasy VII Remake one long narrative justification for Tetsuya Nomura and his team to do whatever the fuck they like with the sacred cow that is Final Fantasy VII. And the sacred nature of this beloved game is what makes Final Fantasy VII Remake so bold, while also being so very, very contentious. The game has left some fans feeling cold, some outright insulted, because Final Fantasy VII Remake is not what people were expecting. It's not what it was originally packaged as. In fact, it turns out that the remake part of the Final Fantasy VII Remake name isn't actually a reference to the product, it's a reference to the narrative. It is literally remaking the continuity of Final Fantasy VII. As someone intensely, maybe overly familiar with Final Fantasy VII, as someone who's been obsessed with that game since he was 15, Final Fantasy VII Remake is a borderline surreal experience, a mindfuck if you will. While it does follow the original Final Fantasy VII's narrative threads up to the infiltration of the Shinra building, so much has been added, expanded, and outright altered as to create a completely strange experience for anyone going into this expecting a straight-up remake of the original. Now, I had concerns that Square Enix would Square Enix it all up when the game was first shown, and a lot of people jumped down my throat because, well, a lot of people expected a straightforward remake, and I said that we might not get that, and people called me a monster and an idiot and a sham. And it turns out I was right. One thing I didn't predict was that a whole bunch of diehard fans would hate the changes made, especially the ending, and I would actually kind of love it. But anyway, the very first Marco Reactor mission, the mission that was shown in the demo, the very first portion of Final Fantasy VII Remake, is highly comparable, in my opinion, to the tanker mission from Metal Gear Solid 2 Sons of Liberty. Very much alike with Final Fantasy VII Remake, the tanker mission put players in a traditional role. They were playing as Solid Snake, and that was the demo as well, and players thought that was the game they were getting. But after that one mission, things go on a completely different and wild tangent, and that's exactly what Final Fantasy VII Remake does. Now, I've given this some thought because even though, as I said, it follows the main narrative threads, so much has been changed. Characters have been improved, enhanced. Pretty much every character got something of an overhaul, even though they're familiar. Their personalities have been deepened, they've been given more motivation and some excellent performances. One of the standouts is Barrett, who in the original localization of Final Fantasy VII makes you wonder how he became the leader of a group of activists, if not eco-terrorists. How is a man who is surly, abusive, unlikable in the initial portion of that game, how is he attracting all these followers? Well, Final Fantasy VII Remake displays what a talented, charismatic orator Barrett is, what a genuine leader the guy is. His speeches are inspiring, he believes fully in what he's doing, he commits every part of himself to the cause, to saving the planet. And this is evidenced in his exaggerated physical animations and the sheer passion in what he says. This is something you feel across the entire game, with the exception of Cloud, who is seemingly even more of a personality void this time. With the exception of him, everyone else, Aerith, wonderfully charming, cheeky character. Tifa, somewhat playful and sardonic, and an out-and-out badass. In fact, I want a game similar to Devil May Cry 5 using a lot of this battle system where you play as Tifa because, well, we'll talk about the gameplay some, but let me just say right now, Tifa is just a joy to play as. Anyway, we're talking about characters right now. Not just the main cast, but the supporting cast have been given some terrific overhauls. Don Corneo, for example, is now, for all intents and purposes, an Adam West-era Batman villain. Hojo is such a skeevy, creepy piece of shit in this one. I haven't had such sleazy vibes off a character since Colonel Volgin in Snake Eater. But the changes run so much deeper than that. Entirely new characters have been added, entirely new stories have been added. There's an entire section where you help Jessie basically rob her dying dad so that she can go and get better blasting supplies for the next bombing mission, and that involves an entirely new character called Roche, who is this soldier who wants to fuck his motorbike quite clearly, and it's just an entirely new part to Final Fantasy VII, which establishes an excellent new character. Roche is actually fabulous, and provides some extra characterization for Jessie and Wedge and Biggs, basically the Avalanche characters who quite famously die in the original and get so much more fleshing out here so that things that happen to them throughout the course of the game become that much more emotionally effective. But even the familiar stuff has been altered. Everything, every aspect of Final Fantasy VII has been recontextualized, reframed, or straight up replaced. For example, Shinra are now using Avalanche as a pretext to go to war with Wu Tai again because they've tied Avalanche to Wu Tai. There's a new Avalanche. There's an entire big militant organization of Avalanche, and the group you're with is a Splinter Cell. And the way I came to look at Final Fantasy VII Remake as I played it was this. It's not a remake in the traditional sense. Well, I mean, certainly not a shot-for-shot remake. It is a remake in the same way that Christopher Nolan's Batman films were a remake of the Batman comics. Final Fantasy VII Remake is, for the most part, an adaptation more than anything else. It's another version. When you look at things like the remakes of Resident Evil 2 and Resident Evil 3, I see those as such a step above the original as to render those originals obsolete. Final Fantasy VII Remake does not render the original obsolete, even though narratively it kind of tries to, but only within the narrative, not on a meta level. I'll explain that in a second. What we've seen with Final Fantasy VII Remake is what we see with comic book adaptations, or any adaptation of an existing work, where a director and their new creative team take a familiar work and want to put their own stamp on it, so what we get is familiar, but really quite different. One good example I can give you here is, you know how in comic book movies there's usually some character or some entity that's a reference to something from the comics. It's got the same name, but it's completely different. It's thrown in as an aside for people familiar with the original to sort of wink and nod and say, oh, I know that. That character's called Victor Zsasz. I know that character from the comics. You see that with this game. There's a Colosseum, an arena at one point, which again is a whole new addition to the game. You go into this arena and there's a boss fight you have there against the Hell House. Now, the Hell House was a tough, but a regular enemy in the slums in Final Fantasy VII, the original. Here, it's been reframed as a significant challenge, a one-off boss fight. It's like seeing Michael Mando as Matt Gargan in Spider-Man Homecoming, or the reference to the chameleon in its sequel. So while the Resident Evil remakes feel like adequate replacements for the original, this feels more like a companion. The original version of Final Fantasy VII is such a different thing, and narratively going forward will be such a different thing, that I view this the same way I view Little Shop of Horrors the musical as compared to Little Shop of Horrors the original black and white horror film. Now, it must be said that, well, what could only be described as Kingdom Hearts bullshit permeates Final Fantasy VII Remake. Shouldn't be a surprise with Nomura's involvement. Throughout the game, there are now these little shrouded hooded things without personalities, which apparently Nomura just absolutely loves. We've got the Heartless and the Nobodies and the Dusks, and now we've got the Whispers. Little shrouded hooded things with no personality that show up all throughout the game and make me cringe because they're cringeworthy. So there definitely is a heavy strain of Kingdom Hearts flavoured nonsense running throughout the game, but that doesn't take away from the just from the wonderful characterization and the writing and everything that was involved with the game. Whereas I find Kingdom Hearts almost alienatingly gibberish, the characters and the events in Final Fantasy VII Remake are still very relatable, very evocative. I can't relate to Kingdom Hearts' story at all. It's too much abstract absurdity. Now, before we get into the ending, let's discuss the gameplay. Let's actually talk about the gameplay. I'm sure some of you are interested in that. It's great. I feel like for many years, Square Enix has tried to reinvent the wheel with turn-based combat, trying to make it more action-oriented, more real-time, and I've always felt that the results were fairly messy, fairly sloppy. They've gotten better over time, and even though I still thought it was a bit messy and loose in Final Fantasy XV, it was still pretty damn good, and that game was a great laugh. Final Fantasy VII Remake, in my opinion, has refined that system. It now feels, to me at least, really, really responsive, satisfying. It's very busy. My old brain struggles to comprehend what's going on, but certainly towards the end, far later into the game than I'd care to admit, the combat system clicked with me more, and I got more familiar with each character. Every character plays differently. You can equip the same materia to all of them, but every character has their own set of special moves, their own ways in which they can be optimized. Tifa, who I mentioned earlier, can strengthen up her physical attacks and set enemies up rather, to be weakened and pressured and then staggered. That's a big part of the game, is exploiting the enemy's weaknesses so that they become staggered and susceptible to taking more damage. Cloud can switch melee modes. He can become a fast-moving operative or a slower but more physically damaging punisher. Barrett, of course, is a ranged fighter with his gun, very tanky. Aerith has been vastly improved from the original game, not just capable of casting support magic and being good with the old healing, but having a range of devastating magical offensive abilities as well. Characters perform regular attacks while their ATB gauge fills, and when an ATB gauge is filled, they can then use that gauge to perform special abilities or magical spells or use items. It's a good little system, lends a tactical edge to it. You've always got to keep an oversight on what's going on. You've got to pay attention to the screen so you know when to block enemy attacks, and you've got to pay attention to the bars so you know when you can perform your more useful attacks. It's possible to get yourself into a really nice rhythm of switching from character to character, building up their ATB, performing a move, switching to another one, and timing all of your moves to set enemies up for the perfect stagger, the perfect moment where you can collapse them and then hit them with everything you've got. And I absolutely love that diversity of character. One of the criticisms longtime fans had of the original Final Fantasy VII way back in the day was how similar all the characters were. There weren't jobs, there were statistical differences, but with materia, they could pretty much all play the same. Whereas here, thanks to unique abilities that the characters can get, that only expands. You know, every new weapon has an ability tied into it, and if you use that ability with the weapon, you can become proficient in that ability and then use it regardless of your weapon. And the result is 4 very different playable characters. Aerith hanging back, having to protect herself, but able to cast wards on the floor that can double the spells you cast. Barrett being tanky, hanging back. I often used him as a support class because he can take hits and stay out of damage. He was a good healer. You've got Cloud, who is very versatile up front, and then you've got Tifa, who's difficult to use because you've got to sort of keep her abilities going, but once mastered is an absolute delight. Very fast, very just hits so hard and you feel every hit. The game is gorgeous. The soundtrack is a mixed bag. There are some interesting reinterpretations of the original soundtrack. There's some all new music. Some of it's very good, some of it's pretty weak. But overall, this is something to marvel at in the audiovisual department. It's a very, very, very pretty game. With some wonderfully evocative environments, backdrops. They've managed to nail the look and feel. Even though everything's adapted and very different, the atmosphere of Final Fantasy VII is still very much authentic. Now, how much reverence is paid to the original going forward is anyone's guess because of that ending. I've spoken to some friends of mine, they told me they loved the game until the ending because of what it does. And what it does is fucking clever. Offensive to some, arrogant, certainly, undeniably. Genius? In my opinion, yes. So if you're this far into the video already, you likely know what's happened, or you don't care, in which case I don't know why you've watched this far. But anyway, those whispers I talked about, they were trying to protect the original Final Fantasy VII story from Square Enix, basically. Square Enix wants to fuck with Final Fantasy VII's timeline, and Final Fantasy VII Remake exists to give Square Enix explicit permission to do so, and make the player complicit in that as well, since you're the ones at the end of the day who fight an end boss, which is the physical manifestation of destiny that determines what happened in the original game and is trying to keep it that way. You, as an accomplice, have to stop that happening. And this all may be a fanboyish rescue attempt of Aerith. Basically, as I said, those whispers were protecting the original timeline, but as of the end of Final Fantasy VII Remake, that timeline has been undone. You essentially defeat fate to change the events of Final Fantasy VII, and the game basically ends by saying everything going forward is now unknown. Everything going forward gets to be whatever Square Enix these days would like it to be. We've taken the original characters, we've taken the setting, the world, the initial story, and now we get to do whatever the fuck we like. And that is brave, but if it's used to rescue Aerith, it's also cowardly. So it's a bold, ingenious move that may be applied to a cowardly act, so I'm very interested in seeing how that works going forward. I mean, they've already chickened out of killing most of Avalanche, so, you know, unless they do really kill Aerith, in which case it's a double subversion, in which case I'll be doubly impressed. So essentially, Final Fantasy VII Remake is really Final Fantasy VII Retcon, and I can imagine a timeline in which this does infuriate me, in which I join the throng of fans who feel cheated, who feel insulted, but I have to confess, I'm a big fan of reboots, remakes, reimaginings, whatever, that preserve the original story, that still accept the original story as canon. The J.J. Abrams Star Trek films are a good example of this, where, yes, it's a new continuity with a new Kirk, a new Spock, but they acknowledge that the original stories take place in another universe. I like that kind of reboot coexistence. And Final Fantasy VII Remake, ironically, even though it undoes what happened in the first game, it has to acknowledge what happened in the first game for that to occur, which doubles down on my belief that Final Fantasy VII Remake is an adaptation, and in some ways a companion piece, a complementary piece. With this, Final Fantasy VII Remake acknowledges that in another timeline, the original game takes place, and that, because that's exactly the kind of narrative conceit I like, that's allowed me to better accept what this ending does. And it makes me excited for the future. It also makes me worried because, now unshackled from the original, Nomura and his team have now granted themselves full license to fill it with Kingdom Hearts bullshit. And I'm hoping against hope they don't do that, because this Final Fantasy VII Remake shows just how human and heartwarming and endearing a Square Enix game can be in the modern day. Similar to what many aspects of Final Fantasy XV did. They can make relatable games with relatable characters, and I'd like to see more of that and less of this cringy whisper shit. History, I do think, will look back fondly on Final Fantasy VII Remake, certainly in the time between now and whenever the next one comes along, and I think history will stay kind and fond towards this game if the next one is very good. If the next one is a load of wank, then I think that will change the way we contextualize this original. But I do think once the dust has settled, once people have calmed down, once the initial shock of what this game does has subsided, I do think this will go down in history as a remarkable subversion. One that I think anyone has a right to be upset by if they were expecting something else, and let's face it, they can't be blamed for expecting something else when they buy a game called Final Fantasy VII Remake. They weren't supposed to know there was some sly double meaning in the name. But nonetheless, On a personal level, I loved Final Fantasy VII Remake. There's some stuff in it that wastes the player's time. The side quests are all filler fluff. There are too many sequences where you're walking around doing nothing, and the game actually has designed it that way. It's just wait here and wander around and do nothing. It plays for time in several situations, which is weird, because they filled the game with so much extra stuff. They didn't really need to play for time. But aside from the occasional exasperation and annoyance with it, I can't say I had a bad time at all with this. In fact, I laughed at this game more than I have any game in a long time. There's some genuine humour in here that really lands. One of the fears I had with this game was that it would be a little too latter-day Square Enix and be all po-faced and miserable. The demo showed off Heidegger, for example, who looked all serious when in the original he's all bellowing and laughing. And the very first time you see him in the full game, he hits out with rah ha ha ha, because he's brilliant. At times this game is hilarious, at times it's simply confusing, it's often jaw-dropping. Final Fantasy VII Remake is a fucking trip. I never thought a remake of Final Fantasy VII would be so strange, so surreal, and so bizarre, but that's the world we're in. It's a wild ride from beginning to end that you can even hear in my voice just the baffled amusement I have at Final Fantasy VII Remake's sheer existence. And the fact that something so baffling is also so goddamn entertaining is something of a triumph. And I do just want to say, for some of the fans who are upset at the changes, I was the one who, months before release, who last year expressed worries that latter-day Square Enix would latter-day Square Enix things up. And it turns out they did. Now, luckily, I actually liked the way they did it, but a lot of people didn't, and people jumped down my throat last year for suggesting that Final Fantasy VII Remake may not be this perfect retelling of the game. So I kind of double win here. Not only was I right when everyone told me I was wrong, but I actually like the way Square Enix fucked Final Fantasy VII Remake up. Double win for me, and that, dear viewer, is why Final Fantasy VII gets an 11 out of 10 remake. I forgot to say remake. Final Fantasy VII Remake, 11 out of 10. Yeah. Rufus has so many belts.